Hello, my name is Hanna Samir Kassab. I am a visiting assistant professor at Northern Michigan University, and the paper I'd like to present today is Systemic Transformations in Energy, the BRICS New Development Bank and the Declining Relevance of OPEC. This is for the EMSI conference. I'd like to thank the EMSI committee and organizers for the invitation, especially for making special arrangements for me. Special thanks to Thanos Koulos for his kind correspondence. World politics is quickly changing. This paper identifies two sources of change. The first, the rise of the BRICS and the formation of their new development bank. And two, the breakdown of the OPEC cartel. First, the international institutional cooperation between the Western-dominated Bretton Woods regime and the new development bank led by China may result in increased loans, but gives rise to a fundamental question. Is this an attempt to overturn the system using financial institutions? What contributes to this behavior? The second change relates to the energy arena. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, is being torn apart by internal disagreements. Major member states, specifically Saudi Arabia and Iran, have opposing interests, which is bleeding into their oil cartel. Instead of working together to cut production for higher prices, OPEC countries are defecting. So for the first part of the paper, we'll discuss the New Development Bank. In 2014, during the 6th BRICS Summit in Brazil, the leaders of the BRICS countries announced the creation of the New Development Bank. The announcement stated that the bank should have $100 billion US in initial capital available for investment, contributed equally by its founding members. It should be headquartered in Shanghai, and the New Development Bank aims to finance development projects free of G7 and Western-dominated governance mechanisms. The New Development Bank, like any financial regime or institution, hopes to inject capital into a world system as a way to promote economic transaction, stabilize world financial markets in times of crisis and contagion, and assist in facilitating cooperation between member states. This declaration communicates BRICS' desires to work with more established institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, but also takes specific issue with the reigning structure. Article 19 of the declaration first enunciates a desire to the world to work with the World Bank. However, the declaration takes serious issue with previous institutions, citing a lack of legitimacy, undemocratic practices, and one which, quote, international governance structures designed within a different power configuration show increasingly evident signs of losing legitimacy and effectiveness as transitional and ad hoc arrangements become increasingly prevalent, often at the expense of multilateralism. The founders of the BRICS Bank believed their institution would be more inclusive, saying in their declaration that, quote, we believe the BRICS are an important force for incremental change and reform of current institutions toward more representative and equitable governance, capable of generating more inclusive global growth and fostering a stable, peaceful, and prosperous world. The declaration points out that the existing institutions led by the United States are inherently flawed in their design in two particular ways. The design of these institutions do not allow for the transfer of power from state to state in times of transition, and this is the most important of the two. The IMF governing structure reflects an outdated reality of a post-World War II era. With the rise of the BRICS, it becomes obvious that such arrangements be updated. However, the United States has specifically blocked any modification of institutional governing structures. The BRICS cite IMF quota reforms' constant delay. In 2010, it was agreed that the IMF would reform the quota system to incorporate the advancement of developing countries for the purpose of strengthening the fund's legitimacy and effectiveness. However, in 2016, these reforms have yet to be carried out, and they're blocked by the powers responsible for the creation of these institutions. Voting at the IMF reflects institutional control. It is based on a weighted voting scheme. That is, the number of votes each nation has directly related to its quota in the Stabilization Fund. The Stabilization Fund is a pool of currencies contributed by member countries to assist in times of economic problems like a balance of payments deficit. Ownership is based on a nation's economic size. The number of shares will influence how much voting power you have. Larger shareholders possess greater voting power and influence than others, especially those smaller economies. The United States, because of its economic clout, owns the most shares at the IMF and thus has the most influence. The United States has a voting power that controls the IMF 16.74%, Japan 6.23%, France 4.29%, the UK 4.29%, the People's Republic of China 3.81%, Russia 2.34%, Brazil 1.72%, and Tuvalu 0.03%. So the BRICS countries believe that the status quo and the delayed reform has serious ramifications for political representation in these institutions, arguing that such arrangements are undemocratic, and they have called for change but have been ignored. To the BRICS, the IMF, led by its authors, the Western states, are ignoring changes in power dynamic in the international system by protecting status quo states and blocking the rise of other powers, rather than making room for these rising powers at the table of world governance. Status quo powers have preferred to ignore rising powers, and for that reason the BRICS have decided to go out on their own rather than working within existing institutions, regimes, and frameworks. And this is dangerous. The purpose of the bank, then, is to gain influence so long denied to many of these BRICS countries. China could not be the major IMF shareholder, and so it developed its own institutions. Like the IMF, the New Development Bank voting shares will be determined by the amount invested. Article 2 of the new agreement states, the voting power of each member shall equal its subscribed shares in the capital stock of the bank. China will commit $41 billion to the project, giving it its largest voting rights of 39.5%, almost 40%. Other founding countries will share the rest and have more say in the IMF as a result. Ultimately, unlike the IMF, China will be the major shareholder of the New Development Bank. In sum, the BRICS demand to be recognized as great powers, and so it has been interpreted that the New Development Bank is a forum for projecting power and gaining the influence so long denied to China and other countries. While still in its infancy, the New Development Bank will create competition between banks, as both certainly will advance political purposes as majority shareholders. While the longevity of the alliance is still in question, the New Development Bank may take a life of its own and its representation of Chinese and Russian interests. The second source of systemic transition is the declining relevance of OPEC. On June 6, 2015, the Wall Street Journal reported OPEC would not reduce production, continuing a policy set 6 months ago. The short piece mentioned another important reality regarding the unfolding of OPEC. Quote, Saudi Arabia's decision to maximize its own production and compete for market share against all corners, outside and even within the OPEC, has created huge financial and economic challenges, and other OPEC members are pressing Saudi Arabia to cooperate and cut production. This is especially since the Iranians are planning to increase production. With all these developments, can we still consider OPEC to be a serious player in the energy market? I would say no. I will argue that OPEC is indeed becoming irrelevant. I will identify 3 major developments in the paper, but discuss 2 here. The first of these challenges are 1. Overproduction, global overproduction, 2. Conflict within OPEC between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and 3. The increasing price elasticity of oil. These 3 factors, if sustained over the next few years, will lead to major systemic changes, not just for OPEC and its member states, but for all countries with oil industries like Russia. So I shall focus in this presentation on the latter 2. OPEC exists to coordinate and unify the petroleum policies of its member countries and ensure the stabilization of oil markets in order to secure an efficient, economic, and regular supply of petroleum to consumers. Another, albeit implicit, object was connected to nationalist pride. This was obvious in the 1973-74 Yom Kippur War between Israel, Egypt, and Syria. Member states voted to embargo the West for its support of Israel, and it would mark the first time the cartel effectively set prices. Costs quadrupled almost overnight, from $3 a barrel to $12. Two important producers, Iraq and Iran, are locked in battle, not simply over oil, but for domination of the Middle East. Since 2014, many have been discussing a sort of Cold War between two states for influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. The Iranians have been supporting their Shia brothers, while the Saudis their Sunni counterparts. While many have tried to trace this animosity to the conflict of secession back to ancient roots, the conflict is simply rooted in each state's search for security in anarchy. To have allies reigning supreme in neighboring countries is to deny your competitor that advantage. It is the ultimate goal for these regional great powers. And one way to hit at the power of states is to target their economy. The economies of Iran and Saudi Arabia rely on the price of oil being high to attain wealth and power. To apply a structural realist theoretical framework to this OPEC situation, specifically the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the logic of cooperation is being undermined because certain trend-setting hegemonic actors, Saudi Arabia, is powerful enough to set the energy agenda. It produces almost 10 million barrels of oil a day, as opposed to the next largest producer, Iran, with 3.117 million barrels a day. As of today, Saudi Arabia sees it better to defect from OPEC and pursue a unilateral strategy than to continue to cooperate with Iran and other partners because of factors described previously. Because of the current geopolitical situation, the conflict with Iran, Saudi Arabia sees it in its best interest to drive the price of oil down by ramping up production. With the price of oil being low, Saudi Arabia can accomplish two goals. The first is to hurt Iranian power projection by targeting its economy. Hurting the Iranian economy will only weaken its capacity to meet its political goals in the region. This is being done by the United States against Russia as well. Second, Saudi Arabia hopes to drive inefficient producers out of business. With the price of oil being so low, companies cannot break even, especially those in the United States. These companies will be forced to cease operation or go bankrupt altogether. And once this is achieved, Saudi Arabia can go back to cutting production and enjoying those high prices. This conflict leads to my final point. If players are fighting over market share, then it can be concluded that the nature of oil as a commodity has fundamentally shifted from being a good with inelastic prices to one that is elastic. The oversupply has broken the cartel into an every man for himself environment. And defined, price elasticity of demand measures how much the quantity demanded responds to change in price. Previously, when OPEC worked together to keep the price of oil high, countries and businesses were forced to purchase oil at that amount. In other words, the price did not influence the amount demanded. As a result, OPEC as a cartel has for now ceased to be. For OPEC to work, the norm that nurses creation must survive and thrive in an environment of anarchy. Actors must see themselves as better off than separate. The purpose of OPEC, then, is for the realization of a normative goal of development and power projection. If this normative goal is hampered, then OPEC does not exist. So to conclude, this article puts forward two systemic changes within the framework of energy: the cases of the BRICS Bank and the declining relevance of OPEC. While the competition between great powers may seem dangerous, it presents a clear advantage to developing countries starving for financial capital. I would recommend the United States join Chinese-led banks for two purposes: to assist in providing liquidity to developing countries and increasing reputation, and second, to voice their interests along with the European allies who joined in 2015 within these institutions. OPEC was formed in 1960 for the purpose of increasing the price of oil through production manipulation. In order to survive, the cartel must cooperate and act like it was intended to be a regime. Building on regime theory, the logic of cooperation from a rational perspective allows us to understand why states cooperate or not. For a regime to work, countries must cooperate with each other to achieve a win-win scenario. Thank you very much I would appreciate some feedback, whether questions or comments, in the comment section below. Also, in the description, please find a brief bio and the abstract to this paper. Again, thank you very much, and I hope to meet you all very soon.